Think about the last time you looked at something purely empirical. Maybe you were looking through a microscope in a biology lab, watching a cell divide.
Or maybe just balancing your checking account. Just, looking at the hard numbers.
Yeah, there is a very specific comfort in that kind of data. You see it, you measure it, and it just is. It forms an objective fact. You can build a bridge with that kind of certainty. You can launch a satellite into orbit.
It provides a profound sense of mastery, I think. We live in an era that deeply values what can be calculated or predicted. We like things we can control.
We really do. It offers a very clean, structured way of interacting with reality. You identify a problem, apply a formula, and boom, you get a result.
But then you try to turn that empirical microscope toward the world of human meaning.
And it shatters. It becomes entirely useless. You try to use that same lens on questions of purpose or grief, or specifically the realm of religious faith, and suddenly we find ourselves looking at a landscape that feels incredibly murky to the modern mind.
Yeah, very murky.
So in an age dominated by scientific progress, by artificial intelligence, and by sweeping political upheaval, you really have to ask a blunt question. Is believing in ancient creeds just a form of intellectual stubbornness?
Or does it answer a fundamental human need that neither technology nor politics can ever actually solve?
That is the central paradox we are confronting today. Welcome to our deep dive into the source material. Today, we are unpacking a foundational 1968 theological text that explores the very essence of Christian faith in the modern world.
Our mission is to see how the author of this book navigates that intense tension between belief and doubt. We really want to understand why faith is framed here not as, a mere set of ideas or an ethical checklist, but as a living encounter with a person.
And to do that, we have a fascinating stack of sources for this deep dive into the source material. We are looking at excerpts from the original 1968 text, which actually originated as a series of university lectures.
Yeah, and we also have prefaces added by the author decades later. He reflects on how the world changed after the book's initial publication.
Plus, we are pulling from various academic and theological commentaries that analyze the text's enduring impact.
It is a rich collection. And to approach it properly, before we can even begin to discuss what faith actually is, we have to establish the environment in which faith operates today.
Which, according to the text, is an environment categorized by intense skepticism.
Very intense, pervasive skepticism.
Wow. Which brings up a story. If we are talking about how a modern believer even starts a conversation with a skeptical world, we have to look at the most striking image the author uses early in the text.
Oh, the clown.
Yeah, the clown. He borrows the story from the 19th century philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. It is the story of the traveling circus clown. Let's set the scene for you. Picture a traveling circus that has set up its tents just outside a village in Denmark.
And suddenly, a fire breaks out in the backstage area.
Right in the dry fields. The circus manager realizes the fire is completely out of control. It is going to spread across those fields and engulf the neighboring village.
The danger is imminent. It's real. So the manager sends the clown, who happens to be already in full makeup and costume for the evening performance, running into the village to warn everyone.
The clown sprints into the town square. He is out of breath. He is shouting for help, pleading with the villagers to come put out the fire before their homes are destroyed.
But the villagers do not run for water.
No, they think it is a brilliant advertising stunt to get them to buy tickets.
They applaud. They laugh. The more desperate the clown gets, the harder they laugh. They think he is playing his part brilliantly.
He is weeping, begging them to take him seriously, pointing at the smoke on the horizon. But all they see is the painted-on smile, the oversized shoes,
the ridiculous clothes. And ultimately, because they will not listen, the village burns to the ground.
It is such a haunting, frustrating image. You can almost feel the panic of the clown. The author uses this tragic, absurd story to describe the situation of the modern theologian.
And really, any believer trying to articulate their faith today, the believer feels trapped in the clown makeup of ancient ecclesiastical language.
The author is pointing out a severe communication breakdown. The believer runs into the modern secular village trying to shout about ultimate meaning, about salvation.
But the secular world cannot hear the urgency of the message because of the historical costume it wears. The concepts of grace, sin, redemption, they sound to the modern ear like a relic from a bygone era.
So the secular world views these ancient teachings as mere performances. They see someone talking about angels or sacraments, and it registers in their minds the same way a medieval reenactment does.
Yeah, it is quaint, maybe entertaining, but fundamentally disconnected from the empirical reality of stock markets and scientific method.
The believer feels the agony of knowing the truth, but being completely unable to penetrate the amusement of the audience.
It creates a profound sense of isolation. I mean, if your very vocabulary makes you an object of amusement, how do you communicate?
But here is where the text makes a very surprising pivot. Instead of concluding that the believer and the unbeliever are separated by an impenetrable wall, the author argues that they're actually bound together.
They share a common ground. And that common ground is doubt.
I found this part of the reading fascinating. We usually think of the believer as someone possessing absolute, unshakable certainty. We picture them walking on solid rock.
And we picture the unbeliever as someone who has rejected that rock entirely.
But the author argues that both are actually swimming in what he calls the ocean of insecurity. Let's look at the believer first. The text says the believer constantly battles the doubt of, what if this isn't true?
What if I'm talking to an empty sky and there's nothing but the physical world? That is very honest admission for a theological text.
It acknowledges that faith does not erase human fragility.
But the text goes further, turning the mirror on the unbeliever. The author argues that the unbeliever is haunted by an equally destabilizing thought.
Perhaps it is true.
Yeah, there is a specific narrative from the sources that perfectly illustrates this shared vulnerability. It is an account involving a Catholic priest and a staunch Enlightenment thinker.
Let's unpack that story because it grounds this whole philosophical concept. You have an Enlightenment thinker who is completely confident in his rationalism.
He has built his entire worldview on the premise that religion is just superstition, a psychological crutch.
He is secure in his disbelief.
Yet, during a deep, probing conversation with the priest, the thinker's certainty begins to crack. He is not broken down by a clever theological argument or a sudden miracle.
He is undone by that nagging whisper in the back of his mind. Perhaps it is true.
The mere possibility that there is a creator, that there is an ultimate judgment, disrupts his atheistic certainty.
So even in the act of rejection, the unbeliever cannot fully escape the possibility of belief. Both sides are sitting in the same ocean of insecurity.
The believer is fighting off the fear of nothingness, and the unbeliever is fighting off the fear of God.
The text argues that this ocean of insecurity is the only place assigned for a person to live their faith today. Doubt is not framed as the enemy of faith here.
It is actually the avenue of communication. It prevents both sides from falling into arrogant self-satisfaction.
It prevents the believer from becoming a smug possessor of truth, and it prevents the unbeliever from closing themselves off entirely to the mystery of existence.
They can speak to each other because they recognize a shared human fragility.
Okay, let me pause you there. I want to look at this shared reality of doubt because it raises a very common modern response. What about the person who hears this and says, I am neither the confident atheist nor the struggling believer. I am purely neutral. I am an agnostic.
Ah, the neutral ground.
Yeah. How does the text respond to someone who claims they can just float above this ocean of insecurity by refusing to take a side?
The source material addresses this stance very directly. To do so, it draws heavily on the underlying logic of Pascal's wager.
Remind me how that wager actually works in this context, because people often misunderstand it as just a cynical bet.
Well, the 17th century philosopher Blaise Pascal argued that when it comes to the existence of God, you're essentially forced to place a bet. You cannot simply observe the roulette wheel without playing.
You're at the table whether you like it or not.
Exactly. Yes, that is the point. The 1968 text adopts this framework to address the agnostic. The author argues that while you can be an agnostic in theory, meaning you sit in a room and intellectually conclude the evidence is inconclusive, you cannot be an agnostic in practice.
Because life demands action.
Every single day, you have to make choices. You decide how you treat your neighbor, what you value, how you spend your time, how you face suffering.
In the realm of practical living, you must decide what principles guide those actions.
You must live as if God exists, making ultimate meaning the authoritative reality for your life. Or you must live as if God does not exist, relying entirely on human constructs.
You cannot pause your life while you wait for definitive proof.
There is no neutral gear in human action. Pure neutrality is an illusion because your daily actions inevitably reflect a fundamental orientation toward or away from an ultimate meaning.
Therefore, the author concludes that the agnostic is still swimming in that ocean of insecurity. They are inevitably leaning practically toward one shore or the other,
based on how they actually live their daily life.
So if everyone is in this ocean, the believer, the atheist, the practical agnostic, How does the text propose we step forward? If doubt is the universal starting point, what is the life preserver?
The answer the author gives is quite profound. He says the answer is not a new philosophical proof for God. It's not a tighter argument. It is a radical shift in who we are trusting.
This brings us to the core shift described in the book, the transition from intellectual assent to a personal encounter.
The author insists that being a Christian is not primarily the result of an ethical choice. It is not assenting to a lofty idea. It is an encounter with an event, and more specifically, with a person.
The text highlights that the central formula of the faith is not, I believe in something, it is, I believe in you.
That phrasing changes the entire foundation of religion. It completely rewires how we understand God. To understand how revolutionary this is, the sources ask us to contrast the God of the philosophers with the God of faith.
Think back to ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the ideas put forward by Aristotle.
Aristotle's idea of God was the unmoved mover.
Let's explore that, because it sets the baseline for what human logic naturally assumes about a supreme being.
For Aristotle, the highest possible form of being must be completely self-sufficient. It needs nothing outside itself. There's a concept here called autarky, which means absolute self-rule and self-containment.
If a being is perfect, it cannot lack anything.
And if it lacks nothing, it desires nothing. Therefore, this philosophical God is pure thought, but it only contemplates itself.
It is the object of desire for the rest of the cosmos, but it is completely self-centered.
It does not look outward, and crucially, it does not love.
Why couldn't Aristotle's God love?
Because in ancient Greek thought, love implies a need. You love something because you desire it, because it completes you. A perfect autarkic being cannot have needs, therefore it cannot love.
It simply exists in isolated perfection. It is cold. It is a structural necessity for the universe to exist, but you cannot pray to it. It certainly does not care about you.
By stark contrast, the Christian God introduced in the biblical tradition and analyzed in this text is defined entirely by relationship.
The supreme mode of being is no longer seen as isolated autarky. Instead, the highest form of being is creative power that loves.
God is involved. God is a lover with all the passion of a true love. The author points out that this theology fundamentally reshaped the very concept of what a person is in Western civilization.
We use the word person all the time, but the text dives into its origins.
The sources explain that the concept of person grew out of the early church's struggle to understand God as Trinity, and Jesus as both God and human.
In ancient theater, a persona was just a mask an actor wore.
But in this theological framework, person is redefined as pure relation.
Let's define that term monad that pops up in the readings here, because it helps clarify this.
A monad is a concept of an indivisible, isolated unit, a closed-off fortress of a being. The text argues that a human person is not a monad.
To be a person is to be in relationship. You only know who you are in relation to others.
And Jesus is depicted in the text as the ultimate perfect example of this. He's described as pure openness. He is entirely from the Father, receiving his whole being, and entirely for humanity, giving his whole being away.
There is no fenced-off private ground in him. His entire existence is relationship.
This means that faith itself is entering into that relationship. It is not memorizing a textbook. It is engaging with another person.
That is why the Apostles' Creed, which the 1968 text uses as its structural framework, is formulated the way it is. The Creed did not start as a list of doctrines drafted by a committee.
No, it originated in the early church as a lived dialogue, specifically the baptismal questions.
When someone was being baptized in the early church, they didn't just read a statement. The priest would ask, "Do you believe in God the Father?" And the person standing in the water would answer, "I believe."
It was a vow. It is a response. Faith is essentially a dialogue between the Word, the Logos, that addresses humanity from the outside, and the human response.
You are saying yes to a person who is speaking to you. Oh, wait, hold on. Let me jump in here. We are using this Greek word logos. We see it in the opening of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos.
Yes.
Now, logos translates to reason, logic, meaning. It is where we get the word logic. That sounds very cold and academic. If God is just this relational, loving entity we just discussed, why did early theologians use the word logos?
It is a vital tension to resolve.
Doesn't that just mean cold, hard math and structure? How does the author combine the structural rationality of the logos with the passionate, self-giving love we just talked about?
In the modern world, we tend to separate them completely. We think of reason as cold, calculating, and empirical. And we think of love as a blind, irrational emotion.
A fleeting feeling.
But the author argues that this separation is a tragic mistake. The text asserts that true reason is love, and love is true reason.
How does the text synthesize them?
The author explains that if the foundation of the entire cosmos is the lodos, a creative reason, a structured meaning, and if that reason is simultaneously a person who loves, then the ultimate logic of the universe is love.
Love is not just a chemical reaction in the human brain.
It's the structural fabric of reality itself. Therefore, to act with true love is to act in accordance with the deepest, most rational structure of the cosmos.
So if you separate them, you ruin both.
The author insists on maintaining this unity. If you reduce love to mere emotion, it becomes unstable, whimsical, and ultimately meaningless.
And if you reduce reason to mere calculation, devoid of love, it becomes brutal, utilitarian, and destructive.
The Logos concept insists that the meaning of the universe has a heart, and the heart of the universe has ultimate meaning.
So faith is entrusting yourself to the ultimate meaning and discovering that this meaning knows you and loves you. It is an incredibly intimate view of religion.
It is.
But to fully grasp the weight of this, we have to look at the cultural context in which these words were published. This deeply personal, relational view of faith did not drop out of a clear blue sky.
The historical context is unavoidable if we want to understand the urgency of the text.
It was published in 1968, a time when society was looking for salvation in entirely different places.
The book emerged from a series of university lectures given to students across all faculties, and it was happening right on the eve of the massive student revolts of 1968 that swept across Europe and the globe.
Now, we need to be clear about the parameters of our deep dive into the source material here. The sources discuss the political ideologies of the 1960s, including Marxism and various utopian movements.
Yes, and we are viewing this strictly through the author's analytical lens at that time. The author was observing a profound shift on the university campuses where he taught. He saw that Marxist thought and what he called a secularized Judeo-Christian messianism were effectively replacing God with political action.
Paint that picture for us. What was the mindset the author was observing?
The students were looking at the world, seeing injustice, war, and systemic suffering. Their response was essentially, "We cannot wait for salvation in the next world. The promises of religion are too slow."
We must build the perfect society right here, right now.
Through political revolution and systemic change, they believed that structural transformation would yield human liberation.
And the author's critique was that faith was, in his words, ceding to politics the role of a saving force. He saw a distinct danger that Christianity was being stripped of its transcendence,
Its connection to an eternal God beyond this world.
and turned into a purely historical political message of liberation. Believers were feeling the intoxication of becoming the protagonists of history, trying to force salvation through human systems alone.
The author noted a panic among theologians who were trying to adapt to this immense political and secular pressure. He felt that some thinkers were trying so hard to make Christianity relevant to the modern revolutionary mindset that they were actually dismantling it piece by piece.
And to illustrate this danger, the author uses a brilliant fable from European folklore called Clever Hans. Let's walk through the Clever Hans story because it perfectly captures this idea of intellectual compromise.
Clever Hans is a metaphor for the slow watering down of faith. In the fable, Hans inherits a large, heavy lump of solid gold. It is incredibly valuable, representing true wealth, but it is heavy, awkward, and burdensome to carry on a long journey.
As he walks, he meets a man riding a horse.
Hans thinks riding is much easier than carrying this heavy gold, so he trades the gold for the horse.
It seems like a practical upgrade at first.
But the horse is unruly and throws him into a ditch. Hans decides a horse is too dangerous. He then meets a man with a cow, hoping for a steady supply of milk.
He trades the horse for the cow.
But the cow kicks him when he tries to milk it. Frustrated, he trades the cow for a pig. Then he trades the pig for a goose.
He keeps trading down, exchanging his inheritance for things that seem more manageable, less demanding.
He is constantly adapting to whatever seems easiest in the moment. Finally, he meets a traveling scissors grinder and trades his goose for a simple whetstone.
A rock, just a common rock used for sharpening blades.
Shortly after, Hans stops to drink from a river. The heavy whetstone falls from his pocket and sinks to the bottom of the water.
And Hans walks away feeling completely liberated, empty-handed, believing he has finally achieved true freedom because he has absolutely no burdens left to carry.
Hearing that story, you can see how it applies to theology.
It actually instantly makes me think of the tech world. It is like when a startup develops a highly specialized software platform, the core code, That is the gold. It is complex, it requires training to use, but it is incredibly powerful.
But then, the marketing department wants to appeal to a wider user base.
So in the name of user-friendliness, they start stripping away the complex tools, they dumb down the interface, they remove the heavy computing features, they add trendy, superficial widgets.
And eventually, the software looks like every other generic app on the market.
It has lost the very thing that made it valuable in the first place, and soon it becomes completely obsolete.
That parallel captures the author's warning perfectly. The author uses Hans to describe what he sees happening in modern theology. The gold of the Christian faith is heavy. It demands a lot.
It requires belief in the miraculous, the incarnation, the resurrection, and it imposes moral constraints.
It is burdensome to carry that gold in a modern secular university or a politically charged society that values total autonomy.
Yeah.
So theologians start trading.
They say, well, maybe the resurrection wasn't a physical, historical event. Maybe it is just a comforting metaphor that means we should cheerfully work for a better political future.
That is trading the gold for the horse. Then they trade away the divinity of Christ, saying he wasn't really the Son of God, he was just a highly enlightened moral teacher or a social activist.
That is trading the horse for the cow.
They keep making these endless compromises to avoid offending the empirical modern mind, until believers are left with a useless whetstone.
The faith is reduced to a vague, generic spirituality or a simple call for political activism.
And eventually, even that sinks into the river of history, leaving a complete spiritual vacuum.
The author's warning is that a meaning that is entirely self-made or constantly adapted to fit the current era's preferences is ultimately no meaning at all. If religion just echoes whatever the culture is already saying, it has no independent value.
But if the answer isn't political revolution, and it isn't watering down the doctrine until it disappears, how does the text claim true human liberation or salvation is actually achieved?
That is the big question.
The answer lies in a radical reversal of human logic. The text argues that salvation cannot be constructed by us through systems. It is achieved through a concept the author terms pro-existence, or vicarious representation.
Let's break those terms down. Vicarious representation.
It is the biblical idea that the few are elected by God, not for privilege, but to serve and suffer for the many.
In human terms, we usually think of being chosen as getting a VIP pass, gaining a status of superiority over others.
But the theological concept of election, as analyzed in the text, is an election for service. Jesus is presented as the ultimate few, the one man who stands in and represents all of humanity.
And here, the author specifically pushes back against certain medieval theories of the cross. Often the crucifixion is explained through a rigid logic of mathematical expiation.
Sometimes associated with Anselm's satisfaction theory.
That is the idea that God is an infinitely offended, wrathful monarch. Human sin created an infinite debt of honor, so someone had to be tortured to balance the cosmic accounting books.
To appease God's anger. The text explicitly rejects that framework. The author calls that a rigid logic that separates Christ's work from his person, reducing God to a ledger keeper demanding blood.
Instead, the text describes the cross as the expression of a foolish love.
It is a love that gives itself away to the point of complete humiliation. Jesus voluntarily enters into the deepest isolation, suffering, and sin of humanity.
He offers an unequal exchange.
He takes on human brokenness and gives humanity his perfect relationship with the Father.
So salvation is not about appeasing an angry God. It is about love entering into the darkest parts of the human experience to heal them from the inside out.
And this creates a dynamic system of mutual salvation. The author emphasizes that human beings are not closed monads. We are deeply intertwined.
The text makes a profound observation. No one is saved alone, and no one sins alone.
Our lives spill over into the lives of others, for better or for worse. We are part of a vast web of relationality, which brings in the role of the church.
The author describes the church as a little flock, acting as an Archimedean point. Let's clarify that reference. Archimedes was the ancient mathematician who said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world."
The author argues that the church is meant to be that fulcrum. It is not meant to be an exclusive country club for the saved, hiding from the world.
It exists to continue that pro-existence of Christ.
The church exists for those outside of it. It takes on the weight of the world's suffering and offers it to God, acting as the lever through which grace moves the broader society.
But this brings us to a huge contradiction with how the world usually operates. If you are going to change the world, you want power, visibility, and undeniable force.
The author points out that God does not operate that way. There is a concept here called the law of disguise.
The law of disguise is the observation that God consistently operates through hiddenness, littleness, and the seemingly insignificant.
The author traces a specific sequence through biblical history to illustrate this. First, out of the entire infinite cosmos, God chooses the earth, a tiny, unremarkable speck of dust.
Then, out of all the great, powerful empires on earth, Egypt, Babylon, Rome, God chooses Israel, a small, frequently conquered, marginalized nation.
Then, within Israel, God does not appear in the grand temple of Jerusalem, but in Nazareth, a backwater village that people mocked.
Then the climax is the cross, the ultimate symbol of defeat, criminal humiliation, and powerlessness in the Roman world.
And finally, the church itself relies on the simplest, most mundane elements to communicate grace: plain water, bread, and wine.
In each step, the divine presence seems to disappear more and more into littleness. The majesty is concealed behind the mundane.
But the author argues that precisely in this way, God becomes more manifest as love rather than just as terrifying power.
I have to point out how entirely counterintuitive this is. We live in a world obsessed with virality, with scaling up, with making a massive, undeniable impact.
If you have power, you show it.
You use it to force compliance. Yet the author claims the ultimate power prefers the disguise of a mustard seed. I ask you to explain why the author believes this hiddenness is actually a necessary feature, not a bug.
The text argues that this hiddenness is the only way to preserve human freedom. Think about it. If God appeared in undeniable, overwhelming, cosmic glory tearing open the sky with infinite power, humanity would be coerced into believing.
It would not be a free choice of love.
It would be a terrified surrender to a superior, inescapable force.
You would be like having a gun to your head. You obey the person holding the weapon, but you do not necessarily love them. The choice is made under duress.
By coming in disguise in the fragility of a human life, in the littleness of the manger and the cross, God invites a response of faith and love, rather than demanding submission out of terror.
It requires the believer to look beyond the surface, to trust the foolishness of love over the cold logic of power.
The disguise creates the space for a genuine relationship to form.
But this reliance on littleness and hiddenness leads us to the final major dilemma the book addresses. If God is hidden in the disguise of a humble carpenter who died on a cross, and if the church is the vessel carrying this message, well, the church is incredibly flawed.
It is.
If God is hidden and the institution representing God is visibly compromised by human failure, isn't it actually irrational to stay? How does the text deal with the messy reality of the church?
The author does not shy away from this at all. He fully acknowledges the severe difficulties of the modern mind in accepting the church. He describes the church as a mixed body.
It is not a pure society of the perfect.
It is a complex mixture of saints and sinners, wheat and weeds. The text calls it a scandal that the church clasps sinners to her bosom.
The author knows the history, the corruption, the failures of the institution.
He does. But the argument is that faith inherently demands a community, a purely individualistic faith. Just an isolated individual connecting with some vague spirituality, detached from everyone else, contradicts the very nature of what we discussed earlier.
Pro-existence and the definition of person as relation.
If God is relationship and salvation is mutual, you cannot bypass the human community, no matter how flawed it is. The church's imperfection is actually a reflection of its mission to heal a broken humanity.
A hospital cannot heal the sick if it refuses to allow sick people through the doors.
So the community is necessary, flaws and all. But the author takes it a step further, making a bold claim about the relationship between faith and human reason in broader society.
He argues against the Enlightenment model, which believed that pure, unaided human reason was enough to build a good, moral society.
The text asserts that reason needs faith, and faith needs reason. Without the moral foundation provided by faith, specifically the belief in a creator who endows human beings with inherent, unshakable dignity, society relies only on what the author calls traffic rules for human behavior.
Let's explore that traffic rules analogy. We agree to stop at a red light because it is mutually beneficial. It prevents crashes. It is a utility.
But we don't stop at a red light because the red light has transcendent moral authority.
Right? It's just practical.
But the warning the author issues is that if morality is merely a set of practical traffic rules, those rules can be discarded the moment they are no longer useful or convenient to those holding power.
If there is no ultimate truth grounding human dignity, then utility becomes the only measure of a person's worth.
When human beings are judged solely by their utility to the state or the economy, the results, as history has shown, are catastrophic. The text argues that faith liberates reason from these utilitarian blind spots.
It reminds reason that humans are a gift, an end in themselves, not a means to an end.
But the author is equally clear that the street goes both ways. Faith needs reason just as much. Reason keeps faith from falling into irrational myth, superstition, or dangerous fanaticism.
They are the two pillars of reality. This is why the author warns so strongly against a theological trend he calls modern Arianism. I want to make sure we define that term clearly. Who was Arius, and what is modern Arianism?
Arius was a theologian in the 4th century who argued that Jesus was not truly, eternally God, but rather the highest created being. Modern Arianism, as the text describes it, is the tendency today to reduce Jesus to just a great man.
A brilliant moral teacher or social revolutionary. Why is that reduction so dangerous, according to the text?
Because if Jesus is just a good man, his death is just a historical tragedy, and his teachings are just human opinions. The author insists that maintaining the full divinity of Christ is essential because it is the vital bridge between ultimate, eternal truth, the Logos, and human historical reality.
If you sever that bridge, if Jesus is just a guy with good ideas, then God has not actually entered human suffering.
Faith becomes just a subjective feeling, and reason is left alone to construct its own meaning, which, as we discussed, often collapses into utility.
I hear that argument, but let me play devil's advocate using the modern cultural mindset. Let's look at the multicultural world we live in today. The dominant value in our society is tolerance.
We are told to tolerate all views, all subjective truths, because claiming that one single truth is absolute is seen as arrogant.
If the author claims that deleting faith deprives moral values of their grounding, how does the text account for this push for tolerance? Doesn't insisting on an objective absolute truth inherently make you intolerant of others?
That is perhaps the most common contemporary argument against traditional faith. But the author turns that argument completely upside down. The text asserts that true tolerance actually requires an objective truth to function at all.
Walk me through that logic. How does objective truth create tolerance?
Think of it this way. If there is no objective truth, if everything is completely relative, then there is no higher standard to appeal to when resolving disputes.
If your truth is just your subjective opinion, and my truth is just my subjective opinion, and those opinions clash, how do we settle the disagreement?
Without a shared truth, the only way to resolve the conflict is through power. The stronger person, or the stronger political faction, simply enforces their opinion on the weaker party.
Everything degrades into a competing, subjective power struggle.
The author argues that acknowledging an objective truth, a truth that stands above all of us, which none of us fully possesses or controls, is what actually grounds human equality.
We must tolerate and respect each other precisely because we are all equally subordinate to a higher truth that we are seeking together.
Relativism, paradoxically, leads to the tyranny of the strong because there is no objective moral law to restrain their power.
That is a fascinating connection. It suggests that bowing to a truth you simply receive, rather than a meaning you manufacture yourself, is the actual foundation of human liberation and equality.
It forces everyone, regardless of their power or status, to submit to a standard of justice and love that they did not create and cannot manipulate.
As we bring this deep dive into the source material to a close, let's look back at the immense journey this text has taken us on. We started in that ocean of insecurity, the shared reality of human doubt.
Guided by the image of the Kierkegaardian clown, desperately trying to warn a village that only wanted to be entertained by his costume.
From there, we explored the radical core of Christian faith, not merely assenting to a philosophical theory, but a deeply personal, I believe in you, an encounter with the Logos who loves.
We looked at the historical backdrop of the late 1960s, the temptation to trade the heavy gold of the faith for the useless whetstone of political utopias.
Or watered-down doctrines designed to conform to whatever the modern mind finds comfortable.
And we unpacked the profound, counterintuitive logic of salvation, the law of disguise, where God hides in littleness to preserve our freedom of choice.
And vicarious representation, where the few serve the many, forcing us to realize our inescapable interconnectedness.
It is a sweeping synthesis of theology, philosophy, and cultural critique.
Now, we're going to end strictly with a factual reflection from the source material itself, looking at how the author viewed the aftermath of these cultural shifts.
In a later preface added to the text, reflecting on the decades that had passed since the original 1968 publication, the author specifically pointed to the events of the year 1989.
The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the end of the Cold War.
The author observed a fascinating cultural phenomenon. When those socialist political utopias collapsed in 1989, the very systems that had claimed to be the sole scientifically motivated guide to the future, their failure did not lead to what one might expect.
They promised to bring heaven to earth through political force and structural revolution. But when they fell, it did not lead to a triumphant, joyful return of traditional Christian faith in the West.
People did not suddenly flood back into the traditional churches once the political utopias failed.
No. Instead, the author noted that the collapse of these grand political hopes left behind what he termed a leaden loneliness and a deep inner boredom.
The secularized world found itself orphaned, utterly disillusioned with grand political promises of salvation. But rather than turning back to the traditional church, which society still viewed through the lens of burdensome institutions and outdated dogmas, the culture turned elsewhere.
Society sought out mystical substitutes, highly subjective spiritual experiences, and Eastern philosophies to fill the void.
The author wrote that the struggle to hold on to the heavy gold of the personal encounter, rather than constantly trading it for the whetstone of passing intellectual or political trends, remains the ongoing, unresolved tension of the modern era.
He presents this not as a battle that was definitively won, but as the permanent, challenging condition of belief today.